welcome you all very warmly to this last session of Latin Trade Week. It has been a fantastic week of insights into what's coming up for Latin America in 2022. Some of the sessions that we've run since Tuesday have touched upon issues that have to do with regulations as well as the social and political environment in Latin America and the business perspectives. And going through all of that, obviously much has been said also about the opportunities and the perils and what's going on with respect to international trade and investment. And so what we'd like to do today is try to focus on trade policy, trade flows, and what's going on in the region. My name is Ricardo Meléndez-Ortiz, as I said. I'm a strategic advisor at Latin Trade. We have a stellar lineup of experts on this issue at hand, with a great mix of public policy, private sector, economics, diplomacy, and law. The aim of this session itself, as I said, is to offer our audience a tour d'horizon on the region's progress and setbacks on integration within itself and with the rest of the world, against a backdrop of attention-grabbing developments in 2021 in most of Latin American major export markets. So from the arrival at the beginning of the year of the new administration in Washington, which is an expectation of a 180-degree shift of view on international engagements, but with an international trade policy that is only now emerging. Major initiatives that are reasserting the Brussels effect on international trade and investment policy coming out of the EU, particularly felt on the environment, breakthrough approaches by China in the rapidly evolving and all-important Indo-Pacific region, the conclusion of the RCEP between ASEAN and 6 of its major economies, including 5 major economies, I should say, because India excluded itself from it, but including Japan and Australia and other members of the CTPPP. And now an initiation of accession process to CTPPP and the emerging digital economy agreement that was started by New Zealand a few months ago. There's been tension with the rapid integration of China into global markets, something that has been a case in the multilateral trade system and in fragmented system now for the past 10 or 15 years, with the same issues on the table and resolved. Latin America on its part has been particularly hard hit by COVID-19, the ensuing economic crisis of COVID-19, and best outlooks for the region really look at a very green picture in the absence of very proactive and strategic approaches to escape what I call business as usual. Indeed, some scenarios, one by the Atlantic Council that I mentioned in the invitation to this meeting, shows a decline of Latin American exports between now and 2035, almost constantly, with every region in the world, but also within Latin America itself. So against all this, and again, with fourth industrial revolution technologies continue to sort of gallop in the background, that global imperative to decarbonize and rethink the relationship between economics and natural environment, also as a new issue, a new layer on trade policy and business models for the region. What can we expect for 2022? As I said, we have a great set of panelists. We're going to try to have an agile conversation. I'll try to, after this intervention, be very succinct in my words. We will start with Jhon Miller, who is the Chief Economist Analyst at Trade Data Monitor, really the leader in providing trade data to governments and businesses around the world. Jhon is a seasoned journalist on top of being the chief economist at TDM, And I would introduce after Jhon panelists as they will join us in the conversation. But when we started with Jhon, and what we'd like Jhon to do is to provide for us an overview of trade flows and trends based on this latest available data for the region. Jhon, you've got the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. And hi, everybody. I know a lot of you from my days of covering trade for the Wall Street Journal. So Trade Data Monitor, as Ricardo says, is a data company. We procure data from over 110 countries and wrap it all into one database. The data goes back 30 years and is current up to the last month. So it's an incredible snapshot for looking at the global economy. And that's why I love playing around with this data and looking at it, because you can see a lot of stories happening. In the last 2 years, for example, we've seen this incredible work from home economy develop in the trade data. So imports of furniture and computers, router systems, things you use at home have increased, whereas a trade in shoes and luggage and petroleum, things you need to move around the world have fallen and now rebounding. So you see all this stuff happening in the trade data. So I'm going to talk about the big macro trends that we should all be aware of happening in 2021 and in 2022. I am sharing my screen. I trust, can you guys see that? Yeah. Okay, so one thing that's important to note is that trade has recovered. I mean, the WTO forecasts a 10.7% increase in global trade. Part of this is price inflation, and we'll look at that a little bit later. It's important to understand what's happening in global markets, and inflation really is a real thing. You see that in the trade data. China is still obviously the world's top exporter, followed by the US, Germany, Netherlands, and Japan. We talked a little bit about Biden trade policy, and important to understand how much leverage the US still has as the world's #1 importer. And I think, the free trade consensus of the 90s has ebbed, and I don't think it's coming back anytime soon. And part of that is just this, again, this incredible leverage that Washington has as the world's top importer, although we do expect China to pass the United States next year as the biggest buyer in the world, followed by currently China, Germany, Japan, and Netherlands. Obviously, Port of Rotterdam is a gateway for the rest of Europe. Amongst all the trade partners, Brazil is the top Latin American exporter to the United States. We expect all of Latin America to increase its trade flows to the US as the world sort of calcifies into these three poles of US or Americas, Asia, and Europe. Iron ore is the top category of exports from Brazil. Look at the overall increase in percentage. It's massive. Now, when you look at it by kilos, we break down trade by value and by quantity. It's a lot less, and so that's an impact of price inflation. And again, very important to look at those numbers, and we look at the overall trade numbers to not just look at dollar values, because they've been amplified by these price increases. As the first country to lock down, also the first country to come out of the recovery from COVID, manufacturers in China have really boosted exports a tremendous amount this year, huge percentage increases across almost all categories as supply chains get back up and going. And we have seen basically the global trading system cope with, I know there's been reports of bottlenecks and problems with supply chains, but for most products, things are being made and shipped. And that's important to understand too. This is incredible. If you look at, when China joined the World Trade Organization, it was this dream of other countries tapping into the Chinese market. And they're mostly Asian countries. It's mostly supply chain trade, a lot of commodities. The billion consumers have not really been this sort of panacea for manufacturers all over the world. These are the top suppliers of goods to China. The top Latin American supplier is Brazil. Obviously, that's mostly iron ore. This is the increases in goods by imports by China of goods by quantity, and they're a lot less than goods by value. So again, inflation. Our predictions, so the WTO has said 10.8% growth in 2021 in trade, 4.7% growth in 2022. This is by value, so that should help inflation subside a little bit. The free trade consensus, and this is more of a personal observation than anything we can see in the trade data, but It's not coming back anytime soon in Washington. Very important to understand for trade partners in Europe, especially. I actually spent a whole year in a small town that was hit by globalization, Moundsville, West Virginia, making a movie for PBS about the impact of global trade. And I can tell you in the Rust Belt and sort of politically, again, free trade is not a winner, even for Republicans, which it used to be. Three supply chain poles: Asia, Americas, and Europe. A lot of manufacturing diversity, especially in Asia, led by Vietnam. China will pass the US as the world's #1 importer by value. And again, the creation of these poles should help Latin American trading partners in the United States. That is all I have for now. Happy to take questions after it. Thanks, Ricardo, for letting me speak.
Thank you very much, Jhon. That's a good overview. Let me move, we'll come back to you sort of later in the conversation. Let me move back to the panel, to the larger panel. And we have Antoni Estevardeordal. Antoni, well, other than having more than 30 years of experience as an economist looking at international trade, I always describe him perhaps as the world's foremost expert on trade integration. But this time around, other than your views on trade integration in the region, Tony, we would like to hear from you about the question of GBCs. How is it that Latin America lost the opportunity of the last decade of the fragmentation of markets and production? It really is behind any other region, perhaps with the exception of Africa in that respect. And what do you think is now coming up in that respect, including on the debate of reshoring and nearshoring? Tony, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, and thanks to Latin Trade to bring us together with good all a new friends. Let me just reply to your question, Ricardo, by saying that one of the debates that the COVID crisis has produced in the region, but also globally, is the overall issue of the vulnerability of the global value chain, by the inherent risks that these chains have when they have very specific locations. They have highly dependent on transportation services that when a pandemic comes, like the one that we had, are basically in a lockdown or in some sort of difficulties to use these services. The debate has been between the potential for the reshoring of some of these global chains, meaning that companies will retract to the home economy, or the nearshoring, meaning that global value chains will try to look for nearby shorter supplies, nearby countries to get the inputs. It's important to notice that this, what I would call this COVID effect on global value chains, happens at the same time, or has been compounded, if you will, by the China effect on global value chains. There was already a trend before the COVID on these potential reconfigurations of global value chains because of the China, for economic issues. I mean, China was losing some advantages in terms of their, labor cost and so on. So there was some discussions about how much of this will affect on reconfiguration of this change, but also for geopolitical issues, especially here in the US, but also in other parts of the world regarding the relationship with China. And the question here is now in the region is how much the region could take advantage of this effect in terms of becoming a much bigger player in this reassuring or mostly nearshoring, mostly with the US-led companies. And here, just to advance my conclusion here before elaborating a little bit more on that, I think it's true that there's some opportunities. I think opportunities will be on very niche things, on the margins of any reconfigurations of these global value chains. I don't think it's going to be a game changer like some people claim that this could be. And I will provide like three general observations on why this I think it's going to be the case. The first is what you just mentioned, Ricardo, is just the lessons from our own region. Our own region for the last 15, 20 years has not been able to be an active player in this fragmented production around the world. The importance of global value chain on total trade for Europe is more than 60%. It's around 50% for Asia. For Latin America, when you include Mexico, that is really connected with the US, is around 30%. Is much less when you exclude for Mexico. So this is a question of why the region has not been able to be part of these fragmented networks of production in the last 20 years. We can discuss maybe later on, some of the structural factors of why this has been the case, and I think it has to do with the model of integration that we choose in our region, and we can talk about this maybe later. The second observation about this is the lessons that we have from other shocks that these fragmented networks around the world has suffered in the past. I think most importantly during the global financial crisis, this was mostly a financial shock, and it had some impact on global value chains through financial mechanisms, but it was a heavy disruptions in many of these chains. And also we have to remember some of the shocks due mostly to natural disasters in Japan, the earthquake and the floodings in Thailand, mostly in Southeast Asia. And in most of these cases, the previous GVCs have recovered and have been basically not altered too much of what they were before the shock. And the reasons that we have for this is that how these networks have been put into place. It requires a heavy sunk cost in terms of the infrastructure that is required to have those. And also, most importantly, the trust that you need to build these long-term relationships between suppliers and producers. And the last observation, which I think is the most important one for our, especially for our audience here from the private sector, is to look at actually how this change really operates. I think there's a good reason of why supply management is taught in engineering schools and not in economic schools. This is really an operational issue. And I think we have now 20 years of experience. I mean, I think the private sector has 20 years of experience in how these supply chains operate. There are very complex ecosystems of networks that have been built in many different ways, depending on the sector, depending on the company. And I think that we cannot disregard these operational issues. And most of the literature, if you look at the supply management literature or risk management literature, will tell you that the best way to respond or to adapt or to respond to a shock is not to retrench your global chain to your home economy, and is also not the best strategy to shorten the supply chains. There are very specific strategies that this supply chain management has to respond to whether could be, and this is, I think, is an important distinction that sometimes is mixed, and I'm finishing with this, Ricardo. One is if you want to preserve the resilience of your chain, which has to do with the ability to return to production after a lapse following a shock, or the robustness of a chain, which means that you want to maintain production even during the shock. There's two different ways in which these chains have to be operated. And there's very specific strategies in how you manage your stocks, how you standardize inputs, very specific technical ways in which you will basically deal with this type of shocks. And the conclusions here, Ricardo, I think is, maybe we can elaborate this in the conversation later on, is first is that I believe that there's some niches in which this flexibility that the system has to incorporate. Definitely there will be more flexibility in these complex environments of fragmented production. And I think it's in the margins of this flexibility where the region could find very specific areas, maybe even at the level of a company level, but it's not going to be a major kind of restructuring or game changer, as I said at the beginning. And the second, and I think this will motivate this audience, this is an area I think where the private sector has to be in the driving seat. I think there's a lot of scope for public-private conversation and how to actually take advantage of these issues. I don't think it's a time for experimenting with trade policy or even industrial policy to try to modify the way these things operate. And I think I will be very cautious on kind of not getting a distraction on what should be the type of policies that the country should implement not in the short term to be a larger player, the region in this area, but a long-term player. And this will require a much more complex set of policies that maybe we can come back later on in the discussion. Thanks, Ricardo.
Thank you, Tony. That was brilliant. Also, it gives us a perfect entry into what I'd like to ask now Constanza and Negri Biasutti to focus on. Constanza is currently the manager for corporate diplomacy and trade competitiveness at the Confederação Nacional de Indústrias of Brazil, and again, a very well-known trade policy analyst. And of course, following on that excellent sort of review of the economics and the of trade integration by Tony, the question is, how do you see from the private sector all this situation and ways forward, Constanza? And how do you think they will react to the developments that we see in other parts of the world?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ricardo and colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here sharing views on such an important topic, but also very challenging. I was thanking double to Ricardo to forcing us to think on a regional perspective, because I think one of the things that happens very often from the private sector is that, of course, we have no doubts that the regional dimension of Latin America is extremely important, but we're not very used to sort of think for a very broad perspective in terms of regions. So either we look into the binationals, sub-regionals blocks, but sometimes we tend to have some more difficulties. And I think this is a very important exercise, even more timely in the current times that we're seeing in terms of trade, economic, geopolitics. And before sharing, going to the specific of the questions that Ricardo put me, I would like to share 3 key points, I would say assumptions that we have from the private sector when we look from this regional perspective. They might be all very known to everyone, but I think it's important because we start from the same point. Probably the first one is that with some sorts of differences and degrees in terms of sectors, if you look into agro, industry, services, or countries, but overall, further economic regional integration in Latin America has been a priority and still is a priority for the private sector. So there's a win-win. Nobody can lose from this, from deepening the regional economic agenda in Latin America. But even though this, it's very clear that it's still a pending task, it's lagging behind, specifically if we look into the sub-regional blocks or inter-blocks initiatives. So we've been seeing tentatives in terms of Mercosur Pacific Alliance closing relations, but still we don't see things happening concretely. But this doesn't mean that there is not regional integration at all. It means, in my view, that it's fragmented, limited to some specific countries, blocks, sectors, topics. So we could say that it's not deep enough, and it's probably not, certainly not fit for the trade for the current times that we are witnessing in terms of economics. So I won't go into the causes of this, and Antoni was some sort of shedding light on this, so we could spend hours on another panel in terms of history. But probably what it's important to recall here, because this is extremely important from the private sector perspective, is the structural challenges that several of our countries have in the region in terms of competitiveness agenda. It's always our basis, let's say, when we look into this agenda of regional integration, trade, call it productivity, education, infrastructure, taxation, finance, industrial policy. Those are the foundations with whom we work and we look into this agenda. So it's very clear that trade, it's important, it can be part of the solution, but when we look to Latin American integration, we need to be realistic. So a sound economic development and regional integration can only come as far as these other elements that I was mentioning are part of the national regional dimension. So when having in mind these 3, let's say, assumptions and realities that we see from the private sector in Latin America, when we mix this and we connect it with the picture of the current scenario that Ricardo was asking me to comment in terms of US-China tensions, the new EU strategy review in terms of external trade policy, I see we can see it in 2 ways. Of course, in terms of the US-China tension, from a very short-term perspective, there have been, and there is very clear some examples of opportunities for some sectors that could gain in terms of market access. But this is not let's say, the only way to see it. When we see it from a systemic and long-term perspective, I think that those developments, they shed light on a very specific question to our countries and to the regions. And that question is whether and what is the strategy towards China, the US, and the EU? So how do we tangle, how do we dance with that triangle? And there's a second aspect that for me, the current developments shed light on, and it's more, of course, relates to the EU, but we can see it also currently with the current government in the US, is what is the strategy and if we have one, towards the so-called trade ends. So the deep FTAs, the big intersection between sustainability, consumer protections, and the trade agenda. So I think the current developments, we could sum up with these two things. And of course, trying to answer whether that's a challenge, an opportunity of a risk. I think it's a challenge for any country. This is not specific in Latin America. We see it in the US, in the EU. But I think that it adds complexity to the main factors that I was mentioning that we perceive in Latin America. For instance, these questions in the case of Mercosur and the sub-region bloc, they put a very clear challenge in terms of a perspective of China and Asia, and how do we look into those countries and regions from the agro sector and the industry sectors. So it brings very essential discussions, let's say, in the way in which we look to our trade relations, economic relations with those countries. So to conclude, I would say that those developments, they are an opportunity and a risk at the same time. An opportunity to define a strategy and implement policies on that front, a strategy that should start at national level, but continues at the regional, ideally at the regional level. But a strategy that above all, I don't have the details of what all the strategy has to have, but it's important that it's not perceived in a sort of dichotomy way. And probably one of the best ways to define that is, I would say, with the philosophy of an open strategy autonomy. So in a sense that we don't need to look into this triangle as an exclusive agenda. We need to look it together. And that doesn't leave, of course, aside the trade diversification and added value need that our region has. And I think it also poses a risk in terms of not embracing and neglecting that scenario, in order, if we would continue with the current by default scenario, instead of taking that as an opportunity to leverage those challenges to foster the economic regional integration. So I'm not a fortune teller, I don't have the answer, but I think and I understand that according to those two scenarios, the way in which our countries, our regions decide to go to put up policies to strengthen current initiatives, either at the WTO in terms of infrastructure in the regions, concrete projects, we will be able to see whether that becomes more an opportunity or a risk. Those would be my initial comments, and I'm happy to share more in terms of Brazil and Mercosur afterwards.
Thank you very much, Constanza. This is, again, it's brilliant. It went very smoothly from, again, Tony's analysis and the numbers, the figures that we heard from Jhon. Let me move on, building on that precisely, to Shunko Rojas. And Shunko is probably one of the brightest minds in the region, looking particularly at strategic issues. Currently, he's a partner at his consultancy firm, Quipo Advisors, but he was a leader developing the Inter-American Development's business dialogue in the region, looking at these issues that we've been discussing about precisely. And then, as Undersecretary for Trade during the Macri administration, Shunko had to deal with the WTO ministerial conference as well as with the G20 presidency following these issues. So for these reasons, again, there's no one, again, as well placed to think about a strategy going forward as Shunko. Shunko, you got the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Ricardo. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today and join the Latin Trade Week this year and share this panel with great friends and colleagues. I think that the year 2022 is mostly going to be similar to 2021, a year of transition. In 2022, most governments of Latin America will focus on responding to the most immediate political, sanitary, and economic challenges posed by the fourth wave of COVID-19, addressing the economic imbalances and social challenges of the pandemic, assistance to the most affected sectors, to the vulnerable groups, to spur economic recovery, and addressing some of the challenges related to increasing inflation and the greater social demands. So as you know, we can expect a challenging global economic context for Latin America, stabilization of commodity prices, probably the reduction of interest rates in the United States, a slowdown in growth rates, both in China and the US, and these all the impacts on trading in Latin America. In addition, countries are going to have very limited fiscal space, and there is a risk of going back to what is known as the old normal, the sluggish growth that characterized the region in the last decade. In addition to this challenging economic context, we face a political scenario of great uncertainty. We have elections in some of the most important economies in the region, Chile now in November, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Brazil. And all this in turn takes place in a context of increasing polarization, political polarization, and increasing social discontent. So I think that in this context of economic limitations and social impatience, governments have a little margin of maneuver, and they will focus mostly on the urgent needs, and there won't be much political capital to be spent in traditional trade agenda, new FTAs. And I think that trade policy will be mostly on the backseat. With elections in key countries, Mercosur and Pacific Alliance will be sort of in a standstill or continue working on a basic mode. Does this mean that there's nothing to do in 2022? No, quite on the contrary. I think that there is an imperative to use very efficiently the little political capital that there may be around. There are a number of areas that need to be addressed, which at the same time are low cost in political terms and at the same time have a tremendous economic and trade impact. First, and this connects to some of the comments of Tony and Coti. First, planning. I think that the region has more or less developed a robust network of trade agreements with both the US and the European Union, and the big pending task is Asia, the most dynamic economic region in the world. The picture today is quite heterogeneous. Some Latin American countries have set trade agreements with some Asian countries, but the region still needs to develop a comprehensive and substantive strategic vision to integrate the value chains, the Latin value chains with the Asian value chains. That could be an ambitious and impactful goal for 2023. But again, first we need to do the homework in 2022. On the other hand, I think that there are also an opportunity and a need to work on planning with how Latin America is going to engage with Africa. I think that the recent African Continental FTA provides a greater opportunity, but again, Latin America needs to think about this in a strategic way and do the homework first and see both at the technical and the political level how to address this. Second, I think that 2022 is going to be an opportunity for housekeeping. Latin America needs to deepen, expand, improve, and modernize the web of existing intra-regional trade agreements. A lot of progress has been done, but still a lot needs to be done. A good thing is that although the work is arduous and highly technical, it requires very little political capital, and the impact of the implementation of the modernization of existing agreements can be huge. Third, and this connects to Tony's point, I think that in light of the global context and the limited political capital, governments and companies would greatly benefit by shifting away from the policy attention focused on trade tools, in particular tariffs, which can be very controversial, and focus on broader policies and concrete initiatives which address critical challenges, where you can build solid and long-term public-private partnerships, consensus, and set game-changing frameworks for greater competitiveness, trade, investment, and integration. As mentioned by Tony, one of the most notable impacts of COVID-19 has been the disruption of global value chains. Both governments and companies are facing huge challenges of shortages, delays, bottlenecks in trade and production networks due to the restrictions triggered by the pandemic. These challenges have made evident the critical need for joint public-private efforts to work on three key areas: trade facilitation, digital trade, and an area that has been mostly relegated in traditional approaches to trade policy, that is regulatory cooperation. I think that if you talk to any supply chain manager and expert in supply chain management, they will definitely say that trade facilitation, digital trade, regulatory cooperation are key aspects to build more resilient and robust value chains. I think that finally 2 words about, let's say, grand strategy and geopolitical challenges. First, next year we have the ninth Summit of the Americas. As you know, it will take place in the US again for the first time since 1994. It provides a unique opportunity for a high-level political consensus around a hemispheric agenda, including trade. So far, I'm a bit skeptical about the potential outcome of this summit, as long as the US continues not to prioritize nor develop a comprehensive or substantive policy agenda for the region. I agree with Tony that the nearshoring approach is good, it's important, but I would have a word of caution about the potential impact in the short term. Second, both the US and the EU are losing ground in Latin America vis-a-vis China. China has become the first or second major trading partner of almost every country in Latin America. For many geopolitical and economic reasons, Latin America needs to remain independent in an independent position in the dispute between China and the US. And in this regard, and to some extent, I think the EU is facing similar challenges. And I think that it would be for the benefit of both regions to deepen their integration and cooperation efforts in order to strengthen a sort of EU-LAC axis that will strengthen and mutually reinforce their strategic autonomy. And I see Rupert in the panel, and I can't help but mention that the implementation of the EU-Mercosur agreement as an obvious low-hanging fruit. Again, I don't think this is a low-hanging fruit for 2022, but after the elections in France and in Brazil, there will certainly be a window of opportunity. And to take advantage of this opportunity in 2023, I think that we need to work a lot and very hard in 2022. So thank you very much, and I close it here.
Thank you, Shunko. That was fantastic. And again, a great compliment and incredibly comprehensive. You have pointed out to some very key issues that I think are new to many in the region that they need to really think through. Let me just highlight, because it will help us also in the comments that we'll hear from Rupert and Jhon Bacchus later on. But what you just said about the similarities in the situation in a way, geopolitically and otherwise, in geoeconomics between Latin America and the EU, but also the notion that, of course, we have to focus in the region and the individual economies in the region, focus on those traditional major markets, the EU, the US, and obviously China, but also the broader Asia region and Africa. Going forward. Let me move sort of immediately to Rupert. Rupert Schlegelmilch, who's been a longtime friend and colleague, as an ambassador of the European Commission with DG Trade, Deputy Director General at DG Trade, concerned with many of the most salient issues in Brussels today dealing with trade. So I had asked Rupert to think about the Brussels effect in Latin America, how he sees this from where he sits, the question of the Green Deal and the Fit for 55, the issue of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, just unveiled yesterday, commodity deforestation-free commodities sort of a strategy and other issues related to monitoring and compliance of agreements that are coming out in very innovative manner, but very sort of in a very compelling way for Latin America to pay attention to. Rupert, you get the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo, and thank you for having me here, because I think this is a very educative thing for me to also listen to the voices from the region. And I will take the liberty to latch on to some of the things I just heard, because I really think they make a lot of sense to me, and I would like to try to react to that. And then I will certainly also, I'm more than happy to talk about some of the ongoing trends in Brussels in trade policy and how it might relate to our Latin America policy. So let me maybe start by thanking all the people who have spoken before me. I mean, they're starting with Jhon's point. I mean, here, if you sit in Brussels and you look at Latin America, the first thing that everybody will tell you, the Chinese influence and the way China has been able to increase by 20 times the trade in the last 20 years, makes a huge difference. We're no longer number 2 behind the US, we're now number 3. So you have to think about the geopolitics, how all the geopolitical weight or much of that is moving to Asia. So you have to think about what does that mean for our trade policy. Point number 1. Point number 2, the numbers don't tell you all the truth, because lots of the trade in agriculture, of course, is all very well, agricultural goods, but I think the ambition of the union, of the region, certainly is not to get stuck on that, but really to upgrade the industrial capacity, the value added, and so on. And if you look at not at the trade, but look at the investment, which is a much more important factor if you really want to create value chains. Antoni has said, Latin America is not as integrated. You don't do that necessarily by trading a lot of commodities. You do that by actually making sure that know-how, capital, and so on transfers between regions and creates value added. And here, the EU is the largest source of FDI in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we are actually investing a lot. So there is a very good basis for some of the future work that we are trying to achieve. We're actually investing a lot more than people know in Latin America, much more than in China or Japan or Russia, etc. So point number 2, if you want to work on that, you have to look at these underlying possibilities. I won't talk about the fact that we're also much closer historically to Latin America and Europe, which is an asset, language, culture, and so on. But the pure fact is that on that basis, you don't necessarily trade enormously more, but you have maybe a better basis to develop the relationship. Then I'd like to also come back to the strategy that we have in this triangle, as Constanza has put it, between the Asia, the US, Latin America, or it's actually 4 if you have the US there as well, Europe. We actually have a very good basis, because if we were to ratify the Mercosur agreement, and I'll come to that in a minute, we would actually have free trade agreements and association agreements, which is actually more than just a free trade agreement, because it includes lots of development, cooperation, and so on, with everyone except Bolivia and Venezuela in the region. I think nobody has that basis to work on again. So we have something to build on, if you wish. And that means, why don't we use it better? And here I'll have to be a bit self-critical. In the EU, we are, as Shunko has said, trade is taking a back seat. It's not only in the EU or Latin America or the US. I think it's generally, except for some Asian countries who are still quite keen to expand market via FTAs, in particular China, of course. We have a real problem in order to convince our constituencies that even such a good agreement as the Mercosur agreement, which is also part of the strategy of a country like Brazil or Argentina to actually be more competitive and allow competitiveness to start not vis-a-vis maybe the Chinese who have much lower wages, but with us who are actually not a threat in that respect, because we will not take, I think, industries or be very effective in industries which are not very sophisticated, because we don't have a cost advantage there. So if you think about that, then you have to ask the question, how can we actually make our capital, if you wish, in Latin America work from a trade perspective? And how can you get, for example, just to be very hands-on, the Mercosur agreement ratified? And here the answer is clearly in what I think is dear to all of us, and that is to be very, very strong on that the future has to be sustainable. The Green Deal, and you asked me to say something about that, Ricardo. The Green Deal is not really very well understood by many people, even in Europe. It's actually a massive, if you're serious about what is in the Green Deal, it's a massive transformation of the whole value chain, if you wish. And now, slowly but surely, we're rolling out some of these legislative proposals, like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, like the deforestation legislation proposal, which came out yesterday. And it will have impacts, and we have to make sure it is understood as being an offer to, in the long term, help each other, help ourselves. because I can already see there would be quite some reaction saying this is all green protectionism, which it should not be and which it is not. But I think the countries in many of our partners actually realize, and they have actually said that again in Glasgow, that there is no alternative. We have to make also trade and investment globally more sustainable. There's no other way we can actually save our own future if you want to make it a bit more dramatic. So we will have a trade policy which on the one hand, and this is the other key point, it will be sustainable, but it will also be open. We will make offers that anyone who wants to work with us in free trade agreements and so on gets the necessary help. This is not a Brussels diktat, but we do think that we can set the example by becoming more sustainable. And this is something which we are doing, and this is, I think, something which I want to emphasize because it's been emphasized by others. In the end, value chains and production and trade is done by companies, not by governments. So we have to bring the industry, the companies along. And I can see from what I read and hear from the region that the private sector in many Latin American countries sees that. They want to help and be more sustainable. Of course, they also want to make money, let's be honest, and some of them want to make more money than others. But still, I think there is a real willingness to help and weed out, if you wish, the black sheep which exists in all the sectors, if I can call it that. So the Green Deal is an offer, and we will continue to have a review of our sustainable chapters in FTAs. I won't go into much of the detail. We will implement some of these autonomous measures like the deforestation agenda, but complement it with forest partnerships, because it's not, as I said, we don't want to impose these things. We want to work cooperatively with the countries in Latin America. And that should lead to even more investment, transfer of know-how, trading opportunities in our market, which is quite big, where there is, I think, also potential. I looked at the figures of exports from Latin America, how much there is value-added machinery, high value stuff. It's growing. It's still, of course, a lot of commodities, but it's growing. And countries like Mexico, for example, have done very well in that respect. So why wouldn't the rest of Latin America also do much better over time? I'll stop here because this was my main message. There is an offer here. We will be more sustainable. We have the trade agreements, future, present, to do it. So now it's time to get this dialogue and the better, I think, implementation of these things going in order to be more effective together with all the objectives that you had mentioned, moving up the value chain, being better connected, having the right kind of growth, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupert. Again, that's a very clear presentation. It also gives us a great idea of what's behind the mind in the EU. It also sort of, in a way, highlights that we continue to live, of course, under this multilateral regulatory system of the WTO, but we have already sort of, as a good friend of mine says in Brussels, we've crossed the Rubicon, and it hasn't been because of the EU new legislations or so on, but because probably of the kind of actions that were taken under the former administration in the US, and continue to build a somewhat more fragmented, deeper system, or more deeply fragmented system, I should say, of trade and investment. And so with that, and also just before that, thanking you for a very positive message, I think, that is coming from you with respect to the region, that we need to pick up and discuss later on a bit more. I'd like to turn to James Bacchus. James is a very old colleague, friend, I should say, former congressman of Florida, first judge at the appellate body of the WTO in 2 iterations there. Also a colleague at ICTSD, both as a senior fellow as well as a board member, and now with the Cato Institute on Cato's Herbert Stifel Center for Trade Policy Studies. Jim, now you have heard everybody in the panel, which gives you sort of an opportunity to comment also on some of the issues that have been said. But if you could bring us into what you think may be the thinking in Washington around all these very challenging issues. Jim, you got the floor.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and it's good to be with all of you. Rupert, congratulations on the deforestation legislation and on your comments just now about sustainability. What about Biden's trade policy? That's the question I've been asked. It's tempting to describe the Biden trade policy as Trump without tweets, but I think that's a little too easy of an assessment. I think it's an overstatement. Yet I do think it is accurate to say that in the Biden trade policy, there's more of a continuation from Trump than there is a departure from Trump. Why do I mean that as my own assessment? First, I think it's important to understand that, as Jhon suggested earlier, there is no commitment to free trade in the Biden administration. There is no overall commitment to free trade in the Congress of the United States by either party. On trade now, my own views are very much out of sync with my own party, the Democratic Party. So I'm disappointed in that, but I'm not surprised. The Biden administration gives token support to multilateralism, but it seems at bottom indifferent to multilateral rules, especially when they seem to get in the way of what they want to do. I would say that second, there is only an increasing push to protectionism domestically in the United States, but increasing bipartisan support for protectionism in the United States. There is some alarming talk about industrial policy. There are some illustrations of an effort to engage in industrial policy, including some of the subsidies and the president's pending reconciliation bill, the social package, for which I would vote, but would be trying to change. In many ways, what we're seeing and hearing from the Biden administration is reminiscent to me of some of the rhetoric 50 years ago in Latin America about import substitution and was it the new international economic order? We're acting as if we're victims in the United States when in fact we continue to lead the world in just about everything. And there's a certain irony in the fact that we are quite rightly, along with our European and many of our Latin American friends, challenging China on its industrial policy practices, but engaging in our own. You see also, I think, in the United States now under the Biden administration, a decided inclination to use trade for geopolitical purposes. And there I'm saying geopolitical rather than economic, because some of these geopolitical positions make no economic sense for the United States, such as many of the actions we've taken against China and our allies in recent years. And there is a hard and almost singular focus on China in much of what we're doing. And the consequence of that is there's not enough focus on our friends in Latin America or even the European Union or Japan or other places. Several examples of how this is manifesting in trade policy. First of all, I would point to the tax credits for purchases of electrical vehicles in the president's current proposed legislation. These are clearly in violation of WTO rules. They're also in violation of rules under the USMCA, as we now call NAFTA. What strikes me is not so much that these proposals are in the legislation, as that I haven't heard anybody in either party in the United States complain about it. We've only heard from the Mexicans and the Canadians, who quite rightly are aggrieved. The US-EU deal on carbon tariffs on steel and aluminum that was announced a couple of weeks ago also raises quite a few WTO issues, as I'm sure Rupert understands. And my point there is not that, but rather that the Europeans have said that in taking these actions, which are planned for a couple of years from now, they will be diligent in trying to comply with their WTO obligations. And I hope they can. What troubles me is that the United States is not even bothered to say that. They're silent on these issues. Two more points. First, I think we're going to see increasingly from the Biden trade policy links of trade to non-trade concerns, including especially labor and the environment and broader issues of sustainable development. Now, as anyone who knows me realizes, I'm pretty much in favor of that, and have been advocating that for 30 years at least. But what concerns me about so much of the nitty-gritty of what the Biden administration is doing is that they don't seem to appreciate that in taking those actions, there are effects on trade, and they need to figure out ways in which they can take those environmental, labor, and other actions effectively, while also minimizing the effects on trade. There too, I think the EU is taking the right approach, but I don't sense that this is even a concern for the Biden administration. Lastly, what does all this mean for Latin America? First, I think you can anticipate a few new trade initiatives from the Biden administration. I'm afraid they're going to be like President Obama was in his first term. He's going to discover trade too late and run out of time and doing what needs to be done on trade. This is purely because of political challenges in trying to advocate trade agreements. Witness the insane decision not to rejoin the TPP. There are other examples. And so I wouldn't expect, if I were a Latin American, to be having to decide whether to accept new trade initiatives from the United States anytime soon. I think we'll see, rather than a coherent trade policy, an ad hoc trade policy from the United States that's founded on these themes that I've mentioned. And as has already been mentioned, I think that Latin America will find itself in the middle in the ongoing trade conflicts between the United States and China. These conflicts need to be eased. I'm someone, for example, who believes that the United States should just go ahead unilaterally and eliminate the illegal tariffs that we imposed on Chinese imports. I think that would be a shot at the arm for the economy. It would help fight inflation. It would reassure the world that the United States wants to abide by the rules, and it could do a lot to help jumpstart a lot of other trade liberalization throughout the world. But the Biden administration is not going to do that. On the supply chain issue, lastly, I've learned a lot from listening here to the concerns in Latin America of not being able yet to fully capitalize on global supply chains. I too think that global supply chains will continue and have to continue. I think what you'll see from the United States is, again, more rhetoric about import substitution, reshoring, shortening supply chains. Some of that makes sense in terms of multiple sources, say, of semiconductor chips, but I think it is impossible in our world for economic autarky to work. It didn't work in ancient Athens, and it won't work here and now. Ricardo, I'm going to stop there, but thank you so much for your time and your ears.
Thank you, Jim. We're at the top of the hour, and of course, this in a way has done its trick. This session, our idea was really to highlight the challenges and then the opportunities for Latin America, digital economies going forward, try to give our audience an overview of what are the developments in major markets, and then how much they need to really put their minds to focus to try to make sure that what we have in front of us is a half full glass rather than an empty one. And I do think, again, from my part, of course, I've made notes that are pages on the issues that I'd like to follow up with all of you and with each of you. I really was fascinated by how each of you have taken very different aspects of what is a very complex puzzle. And I'd like to thank you for that. I think we have done a very good service to anybody who's listening to this. I will follow up, and that's sort of our promise in the next 2 years, as I said, in a periodic manner on many of the issues that you have raised. Just a quick word before closing, that this is the last session of the Latin Trade Week. The sessions are made public in the social media channels of YouTube and so on. We know from experience that that's where they get most of their viewers, but we also will be generating printed articles and digitally as well as in printed form going forward, taking advantage of many of the comments that you have made. I regret, but I actually don't, in a way, that we didn't have much time to go back to your issues. I say don't because you took all the time, each of you, to really make excellent commentaries. With that, I really want to thank you all. You were located in Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Florida, Germany, Washington, and I'm coming today from the island of Baru in Colombia, and it's really been a pleasure to be with you. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. And don't forget Pittsburgh, Ricardo. That's where I am.
Oh, yes. Good, John. Sorry, Pittsburgh. Thank you all.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.